Sheriff Morrison froze mid-step on the courthouse stairs, his radio crackling with impossible words. The security footage couldn't be real. 35 million people had watched the viral video in 12 hours, a massive bobcat attacking 3 armed men to save a 72-year-old veteran, then checking the man's pulse with its paw like a trained paramedic. The footage was crystal clear, shot from multiple angles, and completely defied everything science knew about wild animal behavior. Deputy Collins stumbled backward, nearly dropping his tablet as another wave of comments flooded the screen. "Sheriff, the phones haven't stopped ringing. National Geographic, Animal Planet, every news station from here to New York." Morrison's weathered hands trembled as he watched the video replay. Walt Henderson's unconscious body, the bobcat dragging the old man's cell phone within reach, then standing guard until paramedics arrived. The same Walt Henderson who'd destroyed Morrison's career 8 years ago. "Lock down that intersection now," Morrison barked, his voice catching, "and find that damned cat." How had Shadow known exactly when and where Walt would need saving? And why did Morrison look terrified instead of amazed? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Walt Henderson sat in his weathered recliner, staring at the muted television screen where his own face looked back at him from every news channel. At 72, the Vietnam veteran had grown accustomed to being invisible. Another forgotten old man in a society that had moved on without him. His modest trailer at the edge of Pinecrest County was all he could afford on his meager pension, especially after Martha's medical bills had drained their savings before cancer took her 2 years ago. "Well, Martha," he whispered to the framed photograph on his side table, "looks like our quiet retirement just went to hell." His calloused fingers traced the purple heart medal beside her picture, the only thing of value he hadn't sold to pay for her treatments. The irony wasn't lost on him that after surviving enemy fire in Southeast Asia, he'd nearly been killed by 3 thugs at his own mailbox. But Shadow had saved him. The same bobcat he'd rescued as an orphaned cub 7 years ago, the one he'd hand-fed with a bottle when its mother was found shot dead near the Forest Service road. Walt remembered those sleepless nights, the tiny creature mewing in the cardboard box beside his bed, the way it would purr when he gently stroked its spotted fur. Eleanor Mitchell knocked softly before entering, her nurse's instincts immediately assessing Walt's pallor and the way he favored his bruised ribs. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd spent 30 years fighting death in hospital corridors. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since nursing school, and her kind eyes held the weariness of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "How are you holding up, Walt?" She settled into Martha's old chair, the one Walt couldn't bring himself to move even after all this time. Eleanor had been Martha's oncology nurse, had held Walt's hand through those final terrible months when hope became a cruel word whispered in hospital hallways. "Reporters been calling all morning," Walt said, gesturing at his unplugged landline. "Want to know about Shadow, about how I trained him to be a hero." He shook his head. "Can't make them understand. Shadow ain't trained. He's wild as the day he was born, just different somehow." Eleanor leaned forward, her medical mind already working. "Walt, I've been thinking about when we found Shadow's mother. Those bullet wounds, they weren't from a hunting rifle. The caliber was all wrong, and the entry pattern suggested professional equipment." She paused, watching his reaction. Someone wanted that bobcat alive first. The killing came later. Outside, a familiar shadow moved through the pine trees bordering Walt's property. Shadow had returned, just as he had every few days since his release, drawn by an invisible bond that defied scientific explanation. The massive bobcat's golden eyes held an intelligence that made Eleanor's breath catch, an awareness that seemed almost human in its intensity and purpose. The morning sun cast long shadows across the intersection of Forest Service Road 42 and Highway 49 as Walt Henderson made his daily walk to the mailbox. At exactly 3:47 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, his routine would change everything. The weathered veteran moved slowly, his 72-year-old joints protesting each step on the cracked asphalt. He'd been making this same walk for 5 years, ever since Martha's medical bills forced them to sell their house in town and move to this isolated trailer at the county's edge. The black SUV appeared first as a distant speck on the empty highway, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon light like dark mirrors. Walt barely glanced up from sorting through the usual collection of bills and grocery store circulars. The vehicle slowed as it approached the intersection, then pulled to an abrupt stop on the shoulder just 20 feet from where Walt stood. 3 men emerged simultaneously, their faces hidden behind ski masks despite the warm October weather. The driver was tall and lean, moving with predatory grace. The passenger appeared stockier, built like a boxer, his hands already reaching inside his jacket. The third man circled behind Walt with practiced efficiency, cutting off any escape route back to the trailer. "Walt Henderson?" The tall man's voice was muffled but carried an educated accent that seemed out of place with the crude ambush. "You need to come with us." Walt's combat instincts, dormant for decades, suddenly flared to life. The hair on his neck stood up as he recognized the coordination of their movements, the professional spacing that spoke of military or law enforcement training. These weren't random muggers looking for an easy target. This was planned, personal, and infinitely more dangerous. "Don't know what you boys want," Walt said carefully, his hand moving slowly toward the cell phone in his shirt pocket, "but I guarantee you're making a mistake." The stocky man laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "No mistake, old man. You've been poking your nose where it don't belong for too long. Time to pay the piper." They moved in perfect synchronization, the result of careful planning and previous collaboration. The driver lunged forward while the stocky man produced a black tactical baton from his jacket. The third attacker grabbed Walt's arms from behind, attempting to pin them to his sides. Walt twisted away from the restraining grip, his old training taking over despite his age, but 3 against 1 at his age was mathematics he couldn't overcome. The baton whistled through the air, catching Walt across the ribs with a crack that echoed off the surrounding pine trees. Pain exploded through his chest as he stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The taste of copper filled his mouth, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. The second blow was aimed at his head, intended to end the confrontation quickly and permanently. That's when Shadow appeared. The massive Bobcat materialized from the dense undergrowth as if the forest itself had come alive. 35 pounds of muscle and fury launched through the air with absolute silence, landing squarely on the stocky man's back before anyone could react. The tactical baton clattered uselessly across the asphalt as Shadow's claws found purchase through the attacker's jacket. The man's scream shattered the afternoon quiet, a sound of pure terror and pain that seemed to echo endlessly through the surrounding wilderness. Shadow's powerful jaws clamped down on the man's shoulder, not a killing bite but a controlling one, the kind used by predators to subdue dangerous prey. The calculated precision of the attack spoke to an intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. The driver spun toward this new threat, his hand moving toward something concealed beneath his jacket. But Shadow was already in motion. The Bobcat released his first target and flowed like liquid lightning toward the second man, low to the ground and impossibly fast. 40 million years of predatory evolution condensed into one perfect moment of violence. The third attacker, still holding Walt's arms, made the fatal mistake of hesitating. Shadow's golden eyes fixed on him with laser intensity, and something primitive in the man's brain recognized he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. He released Walt and stumbled backward, his own survival instincts overriding whatever orders he'd been given. But Shadow wasn't finished. The Bobcat moved with surgical precision, targeting tendons and pressure points with the accuracy of a military tactician. Each strike was calculated for maximum effect, with minimal permanent damage. Disable, don't destroy. It was as if Shadow understood the difference between neutralizing a threat and committing murder. The entire confrontation lasted less than 90 seconds. 3 trained men, equipped with weapons and the element of surprise, routed by a single wild animal who fought with the strategic brilliance of a general and the protective fury of a parent defending its young. They limped back to their SUV, the stocky man cradling his mauled arm, all of them casting fearful glances over their shoulders at the Bobcat who stood motionless in the center of the road. As the black vehicle disappeared in a cloud of dust and burning rubber, Shadow's entire demeanor changed. The lethal predator vanished, replaced by something gentler, more familiar. The Bobcat approached Walt with careful steps, golden eyes now filled with concern rather than rage. Walt had collapsed against his mailbox post, one hand pressed against his ribs where the baton had connected. Each breath sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest, and the world kept tilting sideways in a way that suggested a concussion. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, and his vision blurred in and out of focus. Shadow moved closer, his massive head tilting as he studied Walt's injuries with what could only be described as medical assessment. The Bobcat's cold nose touched Walt's wrist, then moved to his neck, checking for a pulse with the precision of a trained paramedic. When satisfied that Walt was alive but injured, Shadow began the most extraordinary behavior captured on security camera. Using his teeth and claws with delicate precision, Shadow dragged Walt's cell phone from his shirt pocket where it had fallen during the struggle. The device had skittered several feet away during the fight, but the Bobcat retrieved it and placed it directly in Walt's palm, even pressing the old man's fingers around it to ensure a secure grip. The gas station security camera, mounted high on a pole across the highway, captured every impossible moment. Shadow positioning himself between Walt and the road, standing guard while the injured man fumbled with his phone. The Bobcat's ears swiveling constantly, alert for the return of danger while simultaneously monitoring Walt's breathing and consciousness. When Walt finally managed to dial 911, his voice was weak but steady. "This is Walt Henderson on Forest Service Road 42. I've been attacked and I'm hurt pretty bad. Send an ambulance." He paused, looking at Shadow, who sat motionless beside him. "And you might want to know, I was saved by a Bobcat. I know how that sounds, but it's all on camera." The 911 operator's confusion was audible even through Walt's damaged hearing. "Sir, did you say a Bobcat?" "Yes, ma'am. Name's Shadow. He's sitting right here making sure I don't die before you folks arrive." 23 minutes later, when the first paramedics arrived at the scene, they found Walt conscious but battered, and a magnificent Bobcat maintaining a protective vigil 6 feet away. Shadow made no aggressive moves toward the emergency responders, seeming to understand their purpose, but his golden eyes never left Walt's face. The gas station owner, Miguel Santos, had already uploaded the security footage to his social media account by the time the ambulance arrived. Within 6 hours, the video had been shared 40,000 times. By midnight, it had reached 2 million views. The hashtag #BobcatHero was trending nationwide by dawn. But in the growing chaos of viral fame and media attention, one crucial detail was overlooked by almost everyone who watched the footage. In the final frames, just before Shadow disappeared back into the forest, the Bobcat looked directly at the security camera and held that gaze for exactly 7 seconds. It was the look of someone who wanted to be remembered. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the hospital exactly 47 minutes after the ambulance, a fact that would later strike Walt as oddly delayed for the county's top law enforcement officer responding to a violent assault. The sheriff's weathered face bore the expression of a man dealing with an administrative headache rather than a serious crime, and his first words to Walt revealed priorities that seemed strangely misplaced. "Henderson, we need to talk about this animal situation before it gets out of hand," Morrison said, pulling up a chair beside Walt's hospital bed, without bothering to ask about his injuries. "That video's already got half the county stirred up, and I've got reporters calling every 10 minutes wanting statements about trained attack cats." Walt studied the sheriff's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted with his radio. Something felt wrong about Morrison's demeanor, but the pain medication made it difficult to focus on exactly what was bothering him. "Shadow ain't trained, Sheriff. He's wild as they come. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Right place, right time," Morrison repeated, his tone suggesting he found the explanation inadequate. "Walt, I need you to think real careful about what you're saying to these media folks. A story like this can take on a life of its own, bring all kinds of unwanted attention to our community." Eleanor Mitchell entered the room carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and immediately sensed the tension between the two men. Her nursing instincts, honed by 3 decades of reading people in crisis situations, told her that Sheriff Morrison's interest in Walt's case went beyond professional duty. There was something personal in his urgency, something that made her suddenly protective of her patient. It was a subtle tell, the kind of nervous gesture she'd observed in guilty family members when confronted with evidence of abuse or neglect. Her medical training had taught her to recognize when someone was hiding dangerous secrets. "Walt, you've been retired from police work for 8 years, Morrison said carefully. "What kind of questions could you possibly be asking that would matter to anyone?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Walt's old detective instincts, dormant but not dead, began connecting dots that had been scattered across years of seemingly unrelated incidents. Martha's doctors mentioning unusual complications in her cancer treatment. The mysterious death of Shadow's mother near the Forest Service road. His own forced early retirement after he'd started investigating a pattern of wildlife crimes that Morrison had insisted didn't exist. Maybe questions about why a healthy female bobcat turned up shot to pieces 50 yards from where I was attacked today, Walt said quietly. Maybe questions about why the ballistics report on that case disappeared from the evidence room. Maybe questions about why certain investigations get shut down before they really get started. Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hospital floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "Walt, you're obviously still shaken up from the attack. Pain medication can make a man's imagination run wild. I think it's best if you get some rest before we continue this conversation." Eleanor stepped closer to Walt's bed, positioning herself between the patient and the sheriff in a gesture that was both protective and deliberate. "Sheriff Morrison, as Walt's attending nurse, I have to agree that he needs rest. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow when he's had time to recover." After Morrison left, Eleanor sat in the chair he'd vacated and studied Walt's face with the clinical intensity she'd once reserved for patients in critical condition. "Walt, how well do you really know Sheriff Morrison?" Walt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the hospital room window. "I trained him, Ellie, 20 years ago when he was fresh out of the academy. Taught him everything I knew about police work, about following evidence wherever it leads, about never letting politics interfere with justice." His voice carried the weight of deep disappointment. Tom Morrison used to be the kind of cop who'd work a case until his feet bled if it meant getting answers for a victim's family. "What changed?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Money," Walt said simply. "Always comes down to money in the end." Then suddenly, everything changed. Her blood chemistry went haywire, her immune system crashed, and the cancer metastasized so rapidly that it defied medical explanation. Eleanor's voice carried the controlled anger of a professional who'd witnessed something unthinkable. "I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I've never seen a treatment protocol fail so catastrophically without cause." The implications hit Walt like a physical blow. "You're saying someone sabotaged Martha's treatment?" "I'm saying someone with access to her medical records and her treatment schedule could have introduced complications that would be almost impossible to detect without specific testing that we had no reason to perform." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. "Walt, I think Martha was murdered, and I think it was done to hurt you." Before Walt could respond, his cell phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The number was unlisted, but the message was crystal clear. "Stop asking questions about things that don't concern you, or next time, Shadow won't be around to save you." Eleanor read the message over his shoulder and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Walt, whoever attacked you today isn't finished. They know where you live, they know your routines, and they obviously have resources and connections." Walt's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. "Then it's time I started asking the right questions to the right people. Martha deserves justice, and Shadow deserves better than being hunted like a criminal for saving my life." Outside the hospital window, evening shadows were lengthening across the parking lot. In the distance, the forest that bordered Pinecrest County stretched toward the mountains, dark and seemingly peaceful. But somewhere in those woods, Shadow was moving through his territory with the heightened awareness of a predator who sensed danger approaching. The Bobcat had lived through the murder of his mother and his own rescue by Walt. He'd survived 7 years in the wild, learning to hunt and fight and hide from those who meant him harm. But the intelligence that had saved Walt's life was also telling him that the real threat was still out there, patient and well-organized and far from finished with its deadly work. As darkness settled over Pinecrest County, 3 different species, human, and bobcat, were all thinking the same thought. The attack at the mailbox had been just the beginning. Eleanor's secret investigation began 3 days after Walt's release from the hospital, when the media circus surrounding Shadow's heroic rescue had reached a fever pitch that made normal life impossible. News vans lined the dirt road leading to Walt's trailer, and reporters ambushed anyone who might have information about the miracle Bobcat. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had been methodically documenting evidence for years, long before Shadow's viral fame made their small community the center of national attention. Using her medical credentials and connections built over 30 years in healthcare, Eleanor gained access to veterinary records, pathology reports, and incident files that painted a disturbing picture of systematic wildlife crime stretching back over a decade. Her nursing background had taught her to recognize patterns in data that others might dismiss as coincidence, and the patterns she was uncovering pointed directly to Sheriff Morrison's involvement in something far more sinister than simple corruption. The first breakthrough came from Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinary pathologist at the State Wildlife Laboratory, who had performed necropsies on dozens of rare animals found dead throughout Northern California. Over coffee in a Sacramento diner, 60 miles from Pinecrest County, Dr. Chen shared information that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "The animals we've been seeing aren't dying from natural causes or hunting accidents," Dr. Chen explained, spreading photographs across the table between them. "These are precision kills executed by someone with extensive knowledge of animal anatomy. The killer targets specific organs that would preserve the most valuable parts for illegal trade while making the deaths appear accidental to casual observers." Eleanor studied the photographs, her medical training allowing her to understand the clinical details that others might miss. How many animals are we talking about? 47 confirmed cases in the past 5 years, but I suspect there are many more that were never reported or found. The estimated black market value of what we've documented exceeds $2 million. Dr. Chen leaned forward, lowering her voice. Eleanor, someone is running a sophisticated trafficking operation, and they have inside knowledge of law enforcement procedures that allows them to stay ahead of any investigation. Meanwhile, Walt was conducting his own investigation from his trailer, using decades of detective experience to analyze the attack and its aftermath. His old case files, stored in boxes beneath Martha's hope chest, contained references to wildlife crimes that Morrison had ordered him to abandon years earlier. Cross-referencing those cases with recent newspaper reports and online forums, Walt began to see connections that formed a web of criminal activity centered on exotic animal trafficking. The pattern was sophisticated and well-coordinated. Rare animals would be captured alive, held in temporary facilities while buyers were located, then transported to private collectors, research facilities, or overseas markets where endangered species commanded enormous prices. The operation required significant resources, political protection, and the ability to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Walt's investigation took a dangerous turn when he decided to revisit the location where Shadow's mother had been found dead 7 years earlier. The Forest Service road was officially closed to civilian traffic, but Walt knew the area well enough to approach on foot through the dense undergrowth that bordered the county maintenance yard. What he found there made him understand why Morrison was so desperate to keep investigators away from the site. Hidden behind a screen of evergreen trees and accessible only by an unmarked dirt road, a series of concrete structures had been built to house animals temporarily. The facility was carefully designed to be invisible from aerial surveillance, with roofing that matched the forest canopy and drainage systems that would eliminate telltale odors. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth around the buildings indicated recent activity, and Walt counted at least 12 separate holding areas capable of housing everything from small mammals to large predators. The professional construction and strategic location suggested this operation had been years in the planning and represented a significant financial investment. But Walt's most chilling discovery was a small concrete structure at the edge of the facility that appeared to be an execution site. Stains on the floor and walls told a story of systematic killing that aligned perfectly with Dr. Chen's pathology reports. This was where healthy animals were butchered for their most valuable parts before their remains were dumped in locations where they would appear to be natural deaths or hunting accidents. As Walt documented the scene with his cell phone camera, a sound in the distance made him freeze. Vehicles were approaching along the access road, and he had nowhere to hide except the dense forest that surrounded the facility. Moving as quietly as his 72-year-old joints would allow, Walt retreated into the underbrush just as 2 pickup trucks arrived at the compound. What happened next confirmed Walt's worst fears about Morrison's involvement in the trafficking operation. The sheriff emerged from the first truck, followed by 3 men Walt didn't recognize, but whose military bearing and tactical equipment suggested they were professionals hired for security purposes. The conversation that followed, clearly audible from Walt's hiding position, revealed the scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise. "The old man's becoming a problem," Morrison told his associates. "This media attention from the Bobcat incident has people asking questions we can't afford to have answered. We need to accelerate the timeline for shutting down this location and moving operations somewhere more secure." One of the hired men, a lean figure with the predatory movements of someone accustomed to violence, responded with casual brutality. "Why don't we just eliminate Henderson permanently? Make it look like an accident. Maybe a fall at his trailer or a car wreck on one of these mountain roads." Morrison shook his head, but not out of moral objection. "Too much attention right now. That damned video made him famous, and any accident would trigger a federal investigation. We need to be more subtle, apply pressure gradually until he backs off or discredits himself. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Walt learned that the trafficking operation extended far beyond Pinecrest County. Morrison was part of a regional network that supplied exotic animals to buyers throughout the western United States and had connections to international markets in Asia where endangered species commanded astronomical prices. But the most shocking revelation came when Morrison discussed his long-term strategy for dealing with potential witnesses. "Eleanor Mitchell is already terminal," he said with clinical detachment. "Her cancer treatment is proceeding exactly as planned, and she'll be dead within 6 months. The beauty of medical sabotage is that it's virtually undetectable and appears completely natural." Walt's hands clenched into fists as he realized that Morrison had not only murdered Martha, but was actively killing Eleanor through manipulation of her cancer treatment. The sheriff had cultivated relationships with corrupt medical professionals who could alter drug dosages, contaminate treatment protocols, or introduce complications that would accelerate a patient's decline while appearing to be natural progression of the disease. As the criminals concluded their meeting and prepared to leave, Walt faced an impossible choice. He could retreat safely and try to gather more evidence through conventional means, or he could attempt to follow them and risk being discovered, but potentially learn crucial information about their next moves. His decision was made for him when Shadow appeared silently beside him in the undergrowth. The Bobcat's presence changed everything. Shadow had been tracking the same criminals who had killed his mother, using intelligence and patience that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. The big cat's golden eyes held a depth of purpose that spoke to years of planning and preparation for this moment. Together, the elderly detective and the wild predator followed Morrison's convoy through the forest, maintaining a careful distance while documenting license plates, routes, and destination points. Shadow's natural camouflage and hunting instincts made him the perfect reconnaissance partner, while Walt's investigative experience allowed him to understand the significance of what they were observing. The trail led to a second facility, larger and more sophisticated than the first, hidden in a canyon 20 miles from Pinecrest County. This operation was clearly the center of Morrison's trafficking network, with refrigerated trucks, veterinary equipment, and holding areas that could accommodate dozens of animals simultaneously. The scale of the operation suggested annual profits in the millions of dollars and corruption that reached far beyond a single sheriff's department. But as Walt and Shadow documented the evidence that could finally bring Morrison's empire crashing down, neither of them noticed the surveillance cameras hidden in the trees around the facility. Their investigation had been observed from the beginning, and Morrison was already planning his response to this latest threat to his criminal organization. The hunter had become the hunted, and the stakes were about to become deadly for everyone involved in the confrontation that was rapidly approaching. The warehouse stood like a monument to corruption against the October sky, its corrugated metal walls hiding secrets that had festered in darkness for years. Morrison's voice crackled through Walt's cell phone with the cold efficiency of a man who had planned this confrontation down to the smallest detail. The ultimatum was simple and brutal. Bring Shadow to the abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the county within 48 hours, or Eleanor Mitchell would join Martha Henderson in an early grave. Walt stood in his trailer's kitchen, the phone trembling in his weathered hands as Morrison's words echoed in the sudden silence. Through his window he could see Shadow moving restlessly through the pine trees, the Bobcat's golden eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. The big cat had been staying closer to the trailer since their discovery of the trafficking operation, as if sensing that danger was closing in from all directions. "You've got 48 hours, Henderson," Morrison had said before ending the call. Bring that animal to the old Pineview Industries building, or the nurse's cancer treatment is going to take a very sudden turn for the worse. And don't even think about calling for backup. I've got people watching every move you make." Eleanor's condition had deteriorated rapidly in the 3 days since Walt's investigation at the hidden facility. What had been a manageable cancer diagnosis with a positive prognosis had suddenly become an aggressive malignancy that left her oncologist baffled, and her treatment team scrambling to adjust protocols that seemed to fail faster than they could implement them. Now Walt understood why. Morrison was methodically murdering her through medical sabotage, just as he had done to Martha. The warehouse complex where Morrison wanted to make the exchange sat on 50 acres of abandoned industrial land that had been empty since the sawmill closed 15 years earlier. The location was perfect for Morrison's purposes, isolated, no witnesses, and far enough from town that whatever happened there would remain hidden until bodies were discovered days or weeks later. Walt's detective instincts told him this was a trap designed to eliminate all three of them, himself, Eleanor, and Shadow. But Walt also knew he had no choice. Eleanor was dying, and every hour that passed brought her closer to the same fate that had claimed Martha. The thought of losing another woman he cared about to Morrison's calculated cruelty filled him with a rage that burned hotter than anything he'd felt since Martha's death. This time, he would fight back with everything he had left. Shadow seemed to understand the situation with an awareness that defied explanation. The Bobcat had been following Walt constantly since the phone call, maintaining a protective presence that spoke to a bond deeper than simple gratitude for past kindness. When Walt sat down to plan their approach to the warehouse, Shadow positioned himself where he could watch both the interior of the trailer and the surrounding forest, his ears swiveling constantly to monitor for approaching threats. Walt spread topographical maps across his kitchen table, using his decades of law enforcement experience to analyze the tactical situation they faced. The warehouse complex consisted of 3 main buildings connected by a network of loading docks and access roads that provided multiple entry and exit points. Morrison would have his people positioned to control all the obvious approaches, but Walt's knowledge of the area gave him insight into alternative routes that might provide some advantage. The plan that emerged was desperate but not suicidal. Walt would approach the warehouse openly, appearing to comply with Morrison's demands while Shadow moved independently through the forest to reach the complex from an unexpected direction. The Bobcat's natural camouflage and hunting instincts would allow him to get close to the buildings undetected, potentially creating a distraction that could give Walt an opportunity to rescue Eleanor and escape. But as Walt studied the maps and considered their limited options, a darker possibility began to take shape in his mind. Morrison was too smart to simply release Eleanor in exchange for Shadow. The sheriff knew that Walt possessed evidence that could destroy his entire operation and send him to prison for life. The only way Morrison could ensure his own safety was to eliminate all 3 witnesses permanently. The realization that this was likely a suicide mission didn't deter Walt from moving forward. Eleanor was dying because of his investigation, and Martha was dead because of his past efforts to expose Morrison's corruption. If he was going to die, it would be while fighting to protect someone he cared about rather than hiding in his trailer while another innocent person suffered for his mistakes. 24 hours before the deadline, Walt received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at his trailer carrying a duffel bag filled with veterinary equipment and wearing the grim expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. The pathologist had been monitoring Morrison's activities through her network of wildlife professionals, and she brought news that changed the stakes of the confrontation dramatically. "Walt, Morrison's operation is much larger than we suspected," Dr. Chen said, spreading photographs across his table. "We've identified trafficking networks in 6 states with estimated annual profits exceeding $20 million. The federal government has been investigating for months, but they need concrete evidence and witness testimony to make arrests that will stick in court. The photographs showed shipping manifests, financial records, and correspondence that documented Morrison's role as a regional coordinator in an international trafficking network. Rare animals captured throughout the western United States were being shipped to buyers in Asia, where endangered species commanded prices that made the risks worthwhile for criminal organizations with sufficient resources and protection. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "Eleanor Mitchell contacted me yesterday. She's been working with federal investigators for weeks, gathering medical evidence about Morrison's involvement in patient deaths. She's not just a victim, Walt. She's been building a case against him while he's been trying to kill her." The revelation that Eleanor was actively investigating Morrison while battling cancer induced by his sabotage filled Walt with admiration and terror in equal measure. She was risking her life to gather evidence that could bring justice for Martha and dozens of other victims, but she was also making herself an even bigger target for Morrison's retaliation. "Where is she now?" Walt asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Dr. Chen's expression grew even grimmer. "Morrison's people took her from the hospital 6 hours ago. They told the staff she was being transferred to a specialist facility in Sacramento for experimental treatment. By the time anyone realized the transfer wasn't authorized, she was already gone." Walt felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had plagued him since Martha's death, the crushing realization that people he cared about were suffering because of his inability to protect them. But this time, he had an ally whose capabilities went beyond anything Morrison could anticipate. Shadow represented a wild card that could potentially tip the balance in their favor, if Walt could find a way to coordinate their efforts effectively. The plan evolved throughout the night as Walt considered every possible scenario and outcome. He would arrive at the warehouse complex exactly on schedule, but instead of bringing Shadow as a prisoner, he would come as part of a coordinated assault designed to rescue Eleanor and gather evidence that could destroy Morrison's entire network. It was dangerous beyond calculation, but it was also their only chance to end the corruption that had poisoned their community for years. As dawn approached on the day of the confrontation, Walt sat on his trailer's front steps watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of their property. The Bobcat moved with the fluid grace of a predator preparing for battle, every sense alert to potential threats. When their eyes met across the clearing, Walt felt a connection that transcended species. Two warriors who had found each other in the darkness and would face whatever came next together. The warehouse waited in the distance, its metal walls hiding secrets that would finally be exposed in the light of justice or the darkness of death. Either way, the long game of corruption and murder that had defined Morrison's career was about to reach its violent conclusion. The warehouse loomed against the gray October sky like a cathedral of corruption, its broken windows reflecting the dying light of what might be Walt's final sunset. He arrived at exactly 6 o'clock p.m. as Morrison had demanded, his weathered pickup truck kicking up dust clouds on the abandoned access road that led to the Pineview Industries complex. The building had been empty for 15 years, but fresh tire tracks in the gravel and the glint of metal in the upper windows told him that Morrison's people had transformed it into a fortress for this final confrontation. Walt's hands were steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what he was about to face. At 72 years old, he had survived a war in Southeast Asia, 30 years of police work, and the devastating loss of his wife to Morrison's calculated murder. If this was where his story ended, he would make sure it was a conclusion that honored Martha's memory and gave Eleanor a chance at the justice she deserved. The main warehouse door stood open like the mouth of a predator, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. As Walt stepped out of his truck, Morrison emerged from the shadows flanked by 4 men whose tactical gear and professional bearing marked them as hired security rather than local criminals. These were the kind of operators who sold their skills to the highest bidder, men who had traded their military training for the substantial profits available in illegal enterprises. "Henderson?" Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Where's our mutual friend?" Walt walked forward with deliberate calm, his hands visible and empty in a gesture of apparent compliance. "Shadow's close by, Sheriff. But before we make any trades, I need to see Eleanor. Need to know she's alive and unharmed." Morrison smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who held all the cards in a rigged game. "Eleanor's safe for now, but her continued health depends entirely on your cooperation. Bring me that Bobcat, and maybe we can all walk away from this situation without any unnecessary bloodshed." The lie was evident in Morrison's tone and the positioning of his men. Walt's decades of experience reading criminal behavior told him that no one was meant to leave this warehouse alive. Morrison couldn't afford to let witnesses survive, and the isolated location provided the perfect opportunity to eliminate everyone who posed a threat to his trafficking operation. But Walt had spent the previous 24 hours preparing for exactly this scenario. Hidden throughout the warehouse complex, Dr. Sarah Chen's federal contacts had positioned surveillance equipment that would record everything that happened in the coming confrontation. More importantly, Eleanor's weeks of gathering evidence had already been transmitted to authorities outside Morrison's sphere of influence, ensuring that justice would be served, even if none of them survived to see it. Morrison led Walt deeper into the warehouse, through corridors lined with rusted machinery and abandoned equipment that created a maze of shadows and potential ambush points. The sheriff's confidence was evident in his relaxed posture and casual conversation, the demeanor of a predator who believed his prey was completely under his control. They emerged into the main floor of the warehouse, a cavernous space illuminated by harsh spotlights that created stark contrasts between light and darkness. In the center of the space, Eleanor sat bound to a metal chair, her face pale but her eyes bright with defiant intelligence. Even facing death, she maintained the composure that had made her one of the county's most respected nurses, the strength that had carried her through 3 decades of fighting for her patients' lives. "Walt," she said as he approached, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm sorry they used me to get to you. Morrison's been planning this for months, ever since the video went viral and people started asking questions about Shadow." Morrison gestured to his men, who immediately moved to surround Walt in a tactical formation that eliminated any possibility of escape. "Touching reunion, but we have business to conclude. I want that Bobcat here in the next 10 minutes, or Eleanor's going to experience the same kind of medical emergency that claimed your wife." The casual reference to Martha's murder ignited a rage in Walt that burned hotter than anything he had felt since her death. For 2 years, he had carried the weight of guilt and grief, believing that her cancer had simply progressed beyond medical intervention. Learning that Morrison had deliberately sabotaged her treatment transformed that grief into a fury that demanded justice, regardless of the personal cost. "You killed Martha," Walt said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who had found his purpose in the face of overwhelming odds. "You murdered my wife to punish me for investigating your crimes." Morrison's smile widened, revealing the sadistic pleasure he took in Walt's pain. Martha was collateral damage in a larger operation. Her death served as a warning to anyone else who might consider interfering with business relationships that have proven very profitable for everyone involved. Eleanor spoke from her chair, her nurse's training evident in the clinical precision of her words. "Walt, Morrison's been systematically killing patients for years. Martha wasn't his first victim, and I wouldn't have been his last. The federal investigators have evidence of at least 12 suspicious deaths that can be traced directly to his interference with medical protocols. The revelation that Morrison was a serial killer, as well as a wildlife trafficker, added another layer of horror to the confrontation. Walt realized he was facing a man who had weaponized the healthcare system itself, turning hospitals and treatment centers into hunting grounds where he could eliminate threats while maintaining the facade of natural death. But as Morrison continued his confession, reveling in the opportunity to describe his crimes to victims who would never live to testify against him, a sound from the warehouse's upper levels caused everyone to freeze. It was subtle at first, barely audible above the industrial ventilation systems, but growing steadily louder as something large moved through the building's superstructure. Morrison's men immediately raised their weapons, scanning the shadows and broken windows for signs of the approaching threat. Their military training was evident in their tactical positioning and communication protocols, but they were preparing for human adversaries rather than a predator who had spent 7 years perfecting the art of silent movement through hostile territory. Shadow materialized from the darkness like a nightmare given form. 35 pounds of muscle and fury that had been shaped by years of survival in the wild and a burning desire for revenge against the man who had murdered his mother. The Bobcat's approach was so silent that the first indication of his presence was the scream of the security operative whose shoulders suddenly erupted in blood and torn fabric. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Shadow moved through Morrison's men with the precision of a military tactician and the lethality of an apex predator. Each attack was calculated for maximum effect, targeting tendons and arteries with surgical accuracy while avoiding the kind of prolonged engagement that would leave him vulnerable to coordinated counterattack. Morrison drew his service weapon and fired repeatedly at the moving Shadow, but his shots went wide in the confusion and poor lighting. The muzzle flashes illuminated brief glimpses of the Bobcat's movement, but Shadow was already gone by the time the bullets reached their intended target, flowing through the warehouse like liquid death. In the chaos of the assault, Walt threw himself toward Eleanor's chair, using his body to shield her from the gunfire while working frantically to cut through the restraints that held her captive. His old combat training took over, the muscle memory of survival techniques learned in the jungles of Vietnam decades earlier. Eleanor's voice cut through the noise of battle with the authority of a trauma nurse directing an emergency response. "Walt, Morrison's men have the exits covered. Shadow's buying us time, but we need to find another way out of here before they regroup and overwhelm him." As if responding to her words, Shadow appeared beside them, his golden eyes reflecting the muzzle flashes while blood matted his silver-gray fur. The Bobcat had been wounded in the fighting, but his protective instincts overrode any concern for his own safety. He positioned himself between Walt and Eleanor and the remaining security operatives, prepared to make a final stand against impossible odds. The tragedy that had brought them together was about to reach its climax in violence and death, but their bond had created something stronger than Morrison's corruption and cruelty. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the fate of everyone who had suffered under Morrison's reign of terror. The silence that followed the gunfire was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Walt crouched beside Eleanor's chair, his hands working frantically to cut through the zip ties that bound her wrists, while Shadow maintained a protective stance between them and Morrison's surviving men. The Bobcat's breathing was labored, blood seeping from a graze along his left flank where a bullet had come too close, but his golden eyes remained fixed on the sheriff with predatory intensity. Morrison stepped into the circle of harsh spotlight, his service weapon trained on Shadow, but his attention focused entirely on Walt. The sheriff's face bore the expression of a man who had finally been pushed beyond the careful control that had hidden his true nature for decades. All pretense of law enforcement professionalism had vanished, replaced by the raw brutality of a killer who no longer needed to hide behind his badge. "Enough games, Henderson," Morrison snarled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "That animal just killed 2 of my men and wounded the others. I'm done playing by rules that were never going to apply to any of us walking out of here alive." Eleanor's restraints finally gave way under Walt's knife, and she rubbed circulation back into her wrists while maintaining the steady demeanor that had carried her through 3 decades of medical emergencies. Despite the circumstances, her nursing instincts immediately focused on Shadow's injury, mentally cataloging the extent of his wound and the resources that would be needed for treatment. "Morrison, you're finished either way," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death countless times in hospital corridors. "The evidence we gathered has already been transmitted to federal investigators. Even if you kill all 3 of us, your trafficking operation is exposed and your medical murders are documented. You're looking at multiple life sentences or the death penalty." Morrison's laugh was a sound like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous and completely without humor. "Eleanor, you always were too smart for your own good. Yes, I'm finished in Pinecrest County, but there are other places to operate, other jurisdictions where a man with my skills and connections can build a new empire. The beauty of corruption is that it's portable." What happened next would be debated by investigators for years afterward. In the official reports, it would be described as a tragic accident resulting from Morrison's mental breakdown and his obsession with eliminating witnesses to his crimes. But Walt and Eleanor, who witnessed every moment of the confrontation, understood that they were seeing something far more profound than simple criminal violence. Morrison raised his weapon toward Shadow, his finger tightening on the trigger with the deliberate intent to execute the animal that had become the symbol of his downfall. But before he could fire, Shadow did something that defied every expectation based on wild animal behavior. Instead of attacking Morrison or fleeing to safety, the Bobcat turned toward Walt and Eleanor and made a sound that was unmistakably communicative. The vocalization lasted only seconds, but its meaning was crystal clear to both humans who had cared for Shadow during his rehabilitation years earlier. It was the same sound he had made as a cub when seeking reassurance, the same gentle rumble that had indicated trust and affection during those long nights when Walt had fed him from a bottle and Eleanor had monitored his health. In that moment, Shadow was saying goodbye. Morrison's bullet struck Shadow's center mass, the impact spinning the Bobcat around and sending him crashing into a stack of abandoned machinery. The metallic clang of his body hitting steel echoed through the warehouse like a funeral bell, followed by a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb all sound from the surrounding world. Walt's anguished cry broke that silence, a sound of grief and rage that came from the deepest part of his soul. He lunged toward Morrison with the fury of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him, his 72-year-old body moving with speed born of desperation and love. The sheriff's second shot went wide as Walt tackled him, both men crashing to the concrete floor in a tangle of limbs and violent intent. Eleanor rushed to Shadow's side, her medical training taking over even as tears streamed down her face. The Bobcat was still breathing, but the wound was severe and blood was pooling beneath his still form. She pressed her hands against the injury, applying pressure to slow the bleeding while speaking to him in the gentle tones she had used during his rehabilitation. "Stay with us, Shadow," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You've fought too hard and come too far to give up now. Walt needs you and I need you, and the world needs to know what you did here tonight." The fight between Walt and Morrison was brutal and desperate, fueled by years of accumulated hatred and the immediate grief of Shadow's shooting. Despite his age, Walt's military training and decades of police work gave him advantages that Morrison hadn't anticipated, but the sheriff was younger and desperate. fighting with the savage intensity of a cornered predator who knew that capture meant death or life imprisonment. Morrison managed to break free from Walt's grip and scramble toward his fallen weapon, his hand closing around the pistol grip just as Walt launched himself forward in a final desperate attempt to prevent another tragedy. The two men grappled for control of the gun, rolling across the warehouse floor while Eleanor continued her efforts to save Shadow's life. The weapon discharged during their struggle, the bullet ricocheting off concrete and metal in a dangerous trajectory that could have struck any of them. But in the chaos of combat, neither man paid attention to anything except the life or death battle for possession of the gun that would determine the outcome of their confrontation. Eleanor looked up from Shadow's still form to see Walt and Morrison locked in what appeared to be a death struggle, their combined age and desperation making the fight as much about endurance as strength. She realized that someone needed to end this before both men killed each other, leaving her alone with a dying Bobcat and no way to summon help. Making a decision that would have terrified her in any other circumstances, Eleanor abandoned her position beside Shadow and moved toward the struggling men. Her 30 years of experience in emergency medicine had taught her how to recognize the precise moment when intervention could save lives, and that moment had arrived. As Morrison gained temporary advantage and raised the gun toward Walt's head, Eleanor struck with the precision of a surgeon and the determination of someone who had spent her career fighting death. Her knee connected with Morrison's wrist at exactly the right angle to break his grip on the weapon, sending it skittering across the concrete floor beyond the reach of either combatant. The sudden absence of the gun changed the dynamic of the fight completely. Morrison, realizing that his advantages had evaporated, made a desperate attempt to flee toward one of the warehouse exits, but his path took him directly past Shadow's motionless form, and what happened next would be recorded by the federal surveillance equipment as one of the most remarkable acts of animal loyalty ever documented. Shadow, despite his mortal wound and massive blood loss, somehow found the strength to lift his head and fix his golden eyes on Morrison's retreating figure. The effort required to move at all must have been extraordinary, but the Bobcat managed to extend one powerful paw directly into Morrison's path. The sheriff's flight ended abruptly as he tripped over Shadow's strategically placed limb, sending him crashing face first into the concrete with enough force to render him unconscious. The man who had terrorized their community for years lay motionless beside the animal he had shot, both of them still and silent in the harsh glare of the warehouse lights. As sirens wailed in the distance, announcing the arrival of federal agents who had been monitoring the situation through hidden surveillance equipment, Eleanor returned to Shadow's side, while Walt secured Morrison's unconscious form. The Bobcat's breathing was growing weaker, but his eyes remained alert and focused on the two humans who had become his chosen family. In those final moments before the authorities arrived, the three survivors of Morrison's reign of terror shared a connection that transcended species and circumstances. They had faced death together and emerged victorious, but the cost of their victory was almost more than any of them could bear. Shadow's sacrifice had saved them all, but the price of justice had been paid in the currency of love and loyalty that could never be replaced. The veterinary emergency room at UC Davis was a cathedral of hope and desperation, where miracles and heartbreak existed in equal measure under harsh fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Dr. Sarah Chen worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing the most important operation of her career, her hands moving with practiced precision as she fought to save Shadow's life. The Bobcat lay motionless on the operating table, his breathing shallow but steady, while monitors tracked vital signs that fluctuated between hope and despair. Walt sat in the waiting room beside Eleanor, both of them still wearing clothes stained with Shadow's blood and the dust of their confrontation with Morrison. The federal agents had completed their initial interviews, documenting the evidence that would ensure Morrison faced justice for his crimes. But Walt's attention remained focused entirely on the surgery taking place behind closed doors. After losing Martha to Morrison's calculated cruelty, the thought of losing Shadow to the same man's violence was almost unbearable. Eleanor's own medical training allowed her to understand the complexity of Shadow's injuries better than Walt could appreciate. The bullet had missed vital organs by millimeters, but the trauma of impact and blood loss had pushed the Bobcat's body to the very edge of survival. Even with the best veterinary care available, Shadow's chances were no better than 50-50, and his recovery would depend as much on his will to live as the skill of his medical team. "He saved us, Ellie," Walt said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. "That cat looked death in the face and chose to protect us instead of saving himself. I've seen brave men in combat, but nothing like what Shadow did in that warehouse." Eleanor reached over and took Walt's weathered hand in both of hers, offering comfort that came from shared loss and shared hope. "Shadow knows how much he means to us, Walt. Animals have a strength that goes beyond anything we can measure medically. If love and determination can pull him through this, he's got more of both than any creature I've ever known." 3 hours into the surgery, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room with the exhausted expression of someone who had fought a battle against death and achieved an uncertain victory. Shadow was alive, she reported, but the next 72 hours would determine whether his body could recover from the massive trauma it had endured. The bullet had been successfully removed, damaged tissue repaired, and blood volume restored. But complications could still arise that would prove fatal despite their best efforts. The decision was made to keep Shadow under observation in the university's specialized wildlife care facility, where he could receive round-the-clock monitoring while minimizing the stress that might interfere with his healing. Walt and Eleanor were given permission to maintain a bedside vigil, their presence providing comfort that medication and technology could not offer. As word of Shadow's condition spread through the veterinary community and the media, an extraordinary outpouring of support began to develop. The Bobcat, who had become famous for saving Walt's life, had now captured the hearts of people around the world who followed his fight for survival with the same intensity they might reserve for a human hero. Donations poured in to cover his medical expenses, and cards and flowers arrived from school children, animal lovers, and complete strangers who had been moved by his story. Morrison's arrest and the exposure of his trafficking network dominated headlines for weeks, but Shadow's recovery became the human interest story that gave people hope in the midst of revelations about corruption and murder. Updates on his condition were broadcast on national news programs, and his medical team found themselves managing a social media following that reached millions of supporters worldwide. On the 4th day after the surgery, Shadow opened his eyes for the first time since the warehouse confrontation. Walt was sitting beside his enclosure, reading aloud from a collection of letters sent by school children from across the country, when the Bobcat's golden gaze focused on his face with unmistakable recognition. The moment of connection was brief but profound, a communication that transcended species and spoke to the unbreakable bond they had forged through years of shared experience. Eleanor was present when Shadow first attempted to stand, his powerful legs trembling with the effort of supporting his own weight after days of unconsciousness and medical intervention. The determination in his eyes reminded her of patients she had cared for during her nursing career, individuals who had refused to accept limitations imposed by injury or illness. Shadow's will to recover was as strong as any human she had encountered, and his progress exceeded every medical prediction. The legal proceedings against Morrison revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise and the lives that had been lost to his greed and corruption. Martha's murder was confirmed through medical evidence that Eleanor had painstakingly gathered. Providing closure for Walt, while opening wounds that would take time to heal. Morrison faced charges in multiple jurisdictions, and his conviction was assured by the overwhelming evidence collected by federal investigators. But the most remarkable development in Shadow's recovery came during his 6th week of rehabilitation, when doctors discovered that his injuries had healed with minimal scarring and no apparent loss of function. His return to full mobility exceeded every expectation, and his behavior suggested that the trauma of being shot had not diminished his trust in the humans who had cared for him throughout his ordeal. The question of Shadow's future became a topic of intense debate among wildlife officials, veterinarians, and the public who had followed his story. Traditional protocol called for his return to the wild once his recovery was complete, but Shadow's unique relationship with Walt and Eleanor raised questions about what constituted his natural habitat. He had chosen to remain close to human civilization even before his injury, and his intelligence suggested he understood the difference between wild existence and the safety of life with his chosen family. Walt and Eleanor spent countless hours discussing Shadow's future, weighing their desire to keep him close against their understanding of his wild nature. The decision ultimately belonged to Shadow himself, they realized, and they would support whatever choice he made about where and how he wanted to live. Their love for him demanded that they put his well-being ahead of their own emotional needs, regardless of how difficult that separation might be. The answer came on a warm December morning when Shadow was declared fully recovered and ready for release. Dr. Chen had prepared transport carriers for his return to the forest, but Shadow's behavior suggested he had already made his decision about where he belonged. Instead of showing excitement about returning to the wild, he remained close to Walt and Eleanor, displaying the same protective vigilance that had characterized his relationship with them before the warehouse confrontation. When the moment came to load Shadow into the transport carrier, he walked calmly beside Walt and Eleanor toward the vehicle, then stopped and looked directly at both of them with an expression that seemed almost human in its clarity. Without any prompting or encouragement, Shadow walked past the carrier and positioned himself between his two humans, sitting down and looking up at them with unmistakable intent. Dr. Chen interpreted Shadow's behavior with the expertise of someone who had spent her career studying animal psychology and communication. "He's made his choice," she said simply. "Shadow understands that he could return to the wild, but he's choosing to stay with the family he's created. This isn't dependence or failure to rehabilitate properly. It's a conscious decision made by an intelligent animal who knows where he belongs." The precedent was unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation history, but Shadow's case had never followed conventional patterns. Special permits were arranged that allowed him to remain with Walt and Eleanor while maintaining his legal status as a protected wild animal. He would live freely on their property, coming and going as he pleased, but with the security of knowing that his chosen family would always provide him with safety and care. As the three of them returned to Pinecrest County, Walt reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the bond that had sustained them through tragedy and triumph. Shadow's loyalty had saved their lives and exposed corruption that might have continued for years, but more importantly, his love had given them a family that transcended every boundary society might impose on relationships between species. The Bobcat, who had once been an orphaned cub, had become the guardian angel who watched over them all, and their story would continue for as long as love and loyalty could sustain the miracle of their unlikely family. 6 months after Shadow's miraculous recovery, Walt Henderson stood on the front porch of his new home, watching the sunrise paint the California mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The modest house that he and Eleanor had purchased together sat on 20 acres of protected woodland, far enough from town to provide privacy, but close enough to the veterinary clinic where Eleanor now worked part-time as a wildlife rehabilitation coordinator. Shadow moved through the morning mist like a silver ghost, patrolling the perimeter of their property with the quiet confidence of a guardian who had found his purpose. The transformation in Walt's life was so profound that he sometimes wondered if he was living in a dream. The lonely widower who had once eaten dinner alone while talking to Martha's photograph now shared every meal with Eleanor, their conversations filled with plans for the wildlife sanctuary they were building together. The bitter anger that had consumed him after Martha's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose that made each day feel like a gift rather than a burden. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her face radiant with the health that had returned after Morrison's medical sabotage had been reversed through proper treatment. Her cancer was in complete remission, a medical miracle that her doctors attributed to the combination of aggressive therapy and the stress reduction that came from living in peace with people she loved. The woman who had once faced death alone in a sterile hospital room now woke each morning to the sound of Walt's gentle snoring and Shadow's contented purring. "Look at him," Eleanor said, settling into the rocking chair beside Walt's and following his gaze to where Shadow was teaching a visiting group of school children about wildlife safety. The Bobcat had become an unexpected ambassador for human-animal cooperation, demonstrating through his own example that trust and respect could bridge any gap between species. "Sometimes I think Shadow understands those children better than their teachers do." Walt chuckled, remembering his own amazement the first time Shadow had calmly allowed a group of kindergartners to observe him from a safe distance while their teacher explained the importance of wildlife conservation. The cat, who had once been a fierce predator, now seemed to intuitively understand when to be gentle and when to maintain appropriate boundaries, adjusting his behavior to match the needs of each situation. The wildlife sanctuary that had grown around their property was becoming a model for rehabilitation programs throughout the western United States. Eleanor's medical expertise and Walt's investigative skills had proven invaluable in identifying and rescuing animals that had been victims of trafficking operations similar to Morrison's network. Shadow's presence provided both security and inspiration for the dozens of animals that found temporary refuge on their land before returning to the wild. Dr. Sarah Chen had documented Shadow's unique abilities in a series of peer-reviewed papers that were revolutionizing scientific understanding of animal intelligence and emotional capacity. The Bobcat's ability to form lasting emotional bonds, his apparent understanding of human communication, and his sophisticated problem-solving skills challenged conventional wisdom about the cognitive limitations of wild predators. Researchers from universities around the world had requested permission to study Shadow, though Walt and Eleanor were careful to protect his privacy and ensure that scientific interest never compromised his well-being. The legal aftermath of Morrison's crimes had brought justice not only for Martha's murder, but for dozens of other victims whose deaths had been disguised as natural occurrences. The former sheriff was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, and his trafficking network had been completely dismantled by an international task force that used evidence gathered by Walt and Eleanor's investigation. The corruption that had poisoned Pinecrest County for years had been exposed and eliminated, replaced by new leadership that prioritized community safety and environmental protection. Walt's relationship with Eleanor had deepened gradually, built on a foundation of shared loss and mutual respect that had slowly blossomed into love. Their wedding had been a small ceremony held in the meadow behind their house, with Shadow serving as an honorary witness and Martha's memory honored through the placement of her favorite flowers throughout the venue. The vows they exchanged spoke not only of their commitment to each other, but to the extended family that included every animal they rescued and rehabilitated. The community response to their work had exceeded every expectation. Volunteers arrived regularly to help with animal care, construction projects, and educational programs that brought thousands of visitors to the sanctuary each year. Local businesses had embraced the economic benefits of wildlife tourism, and Pinecrest County had been transformed from a struggling rural community into a destination that attracted nature lovers from around the world. Shadow's daily routine reflected the perfect balance he had achieved between his wild nature and his chosen family. He spent his mornings hunting in the forest, demonstrating the skills that would have been necessary for survival in the wild. But his afternoons were devoted to his work with visitors and his evenings to quiet companionship with Walt and Eleanor. The arrangement satisfied his instinctual needs while honoring the emotional bonds that had become the defining element of his existence. The most remarkable aspect of Shadow's integration into their human family was his apparent understanding of the concept of legacy. He had begun bringing young bobcats to the property, not as territorial challenges, but as potential residents of the sanctuary. His selection seemed based on criteria that included injury, orphan status, or behavioral problems that made survival in the wild unlikely. These animals received the same careful rehabilitation that Shadow had experienced years earlier, and many eventually chose to remain as permanent residents rather than returning to the forest. Eleanor's medical practice had evolved to include both human and animal patients, her experience with Morrison's sabotage having taught her to recognize signs of abuse or neglect that other healthcare providers might miss. She had become an advocate for victims of medical crimes, working with law enforcement agencies to identify and prosecute healthcare workers who used their positions to harm rather than heal. Her testimony had been instrumental in convicting several of Morrison's associates who had continued his practices in other jurisdictions. Walt's detective skills had found new purpose in investigating wildlife crimes and supporting law enforcement agencies that lacked specialized knowledge about animal trafficking. His reputation as the man who had exposed Morrison's network had made him a sought-after consultant for federal agencies dealing with similar cases. The work provided intellectual challenge and moral satisfaction while allowing him to remain close to home and the family he had found in his golden years. As the sun reached its zenith and the day's visitors began arriving for their scheduled tours, Walt reflected on the journey that had brought him from despair to contentment. The trailer where he had once lived in lonely isolation had been replaced by a home filled with love and purpose. The bitterness that had consumed him after Martha's death had been transformed into gratitude for the second chance he had been given to find happiness and meaning. Shadow approached the porch where Walt and Eleanor sat, his golden eyes reflecting the peace that had settled over all their lives. The bobcat, who had once fought for survival in the wild, now moved with the confidence of an animal who knew he was loved and valued. He settled down between their chairs, his massive head resting on Walt's boot, while his tail twitched with contentment. "Thank you, old friend," Walt whispered, scratching behind Shadow's ears with the gentleness of a man who understood the gift he had been given. "You saved more than my life that day." "You saved my soul." Message for American seniors, 200 words. At 72, Walt Henderson thought his story was over, a lonely widower eating dinner alone, forgotten by a world that had moved on without him. But sometimes life writes the most beautiful chapters when we least expect them. Walt's bond with Shadow, a bobcat he'd rescued years earlier, became a love story that transcended species and transformed tragedy into triumph. When corruption took his beloved wife, Martha, Walt could have given up. Instead, he found family in the most unlikely places: an abandoned animal and a caring nurse who understood his pain. Together, they built something extraordinary, a wildlife sanctuary that became a beacon of hope for their entire community. Walt discovered that the golden years aren't about endings, they're about new beginnings, second chances, and the family we create through love and loyalty. His story proves that it's never too late to find purpose, never too late to fall in love again, and never too late to make a difference. Sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected sources, and the heart that has known great loss can hold even greater love. Engagement questions. Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that changed your life in ways you never imagined? What gives your life the most meaning and purpose during this stage of your journey? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone who needs to hear it today.